As we're nearing the end of class and preparing for the AP test, it's a good idea to go back and review a little bit about economic growth. First, let's just look quickly at the outline of what is actually on the AP test. So you can see here that we have basic economic concepts. That's a lot of stuff that we did in Unit 1, learning about scarcity and PPCs, comparative and absolute advantage, basic supply and demand. This last part, macroeconomic issues, that was our beginning of Unit 2, talking about the business cycle, unemployment, inflation. Their content area, Roman numeral 2 here, which is 12 to 16% of the test, is basically all of the rest of Unit 2. So everything about calculating GDP, calculating nominal versus real, calculating inflation using price indexes, adjusting values such as nominal income or nominal GDP to be real income, real GDP, also with interest rates. And then unemployment, defining and measuring the types of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. So the third part of the AP curriculum, 10 to 15% of the actual test, is going to be on most of what Unit 3 was about, which is all of the aggregate demand pieces, including the multiplier and crowding out, all of the aggregate supply pieces, the different ways of looking at short run and long run, the Keynesian view of sticky wages and prices versus the classical view of flexible, and then of course determinants of aggregate supply, and then this long run equilibrium. You'll see this part 4 is the financial sector, so this is all of what we've been doing in Unit 4, learning about different financial assets. We did a little bit on the time value of money, measures of the money supply. This is really important, banks and the creation of money, the money market, and of course the loanable funds market, and then the role of the Fed in setting these rates. We get to part 5 here and we see, again, a lot of stuff from Unit 3 using fiscal policies, but also monetary policies and how to manage the different types of inflation. You remember the Phillips curve, right? And the short run trade-off versus the long run Phillips curve, which is a vertical line at the natural rate of unemployment. And then we get to these last two pieces, growth and trade. Trade we did in Unit 1. But it's really important to go back and integrate that now and understand the links between trade and the financial markets and the impact of policies on trade. And you'll see highlighted here under economic growth and productivity, really important to go back and revisit the investment in human capital and what kinds of policies will lead to economic growth. So you should feel like, yes, we've really been through all of this material. You should feel pretty confident in it. So let's just go back and look at growth for a moment. We can show economic growth on a production possibilities curve, and this is one of the production possibilities curves from early in the semester, just capital goods versus consumer goods. We're on this production possibilities curve. If we're on this initial curve, A, B, we can't reach a point like C or B, but if we can manage economic growth, we can actually expand the PPC, and we can not only reach C, but we can get all the way to this point B. So it's not that we don't still face choices, we still face scarcity, but our choices are better. We can have more of each good, right? Because we have made better use of, we have developed new resources and we're more productive. Okay, another way to show economic growth is, of course, with the long run aggregate supply curve. So we can see it with long run aggregate supply like that, or we can see it with two entire sets of long run, short run, and aggregate demand. And if you look at this one, it shows a little bit of an increase in the price level, but it still shows economic growth because long run has shifted to the right, short run aggregate supply has shifted to the right, and aggregate demand is not just keeping up, but it's probably encouraging a little bit of this activity to go on. We can also show growth with tables. We can look at things like how much did real GDP grow during this era of the 60s, or from 1973 to 1990, or from 1990 to 2002. And we can actually break that down into increases in the quantity of labor versus labor productivity. So you can see in this particular era, we had we had more than 2.5% growth in labor productivity. We have not equaled that again, right? We saw big increases in labor productivity, also increases in labor, but those are not quite as important to growth as increases in productivity. We can show economic growth by simply plotting over time things like the productivity index and seeing what happens to productivity over time. We can do this also by plotting growth in real GDP over time. So there's a lot of ways to show it. What causes economic growth? One thing that's really important to remember is that aggregate demand shifting alone might cause a short-run increase in your real GDP, but it is not a cause of economic growth. In order for us to say with confidence that there has been economic growth, we have to be able to say the long-run aggregate supply curve shifted. Growth is an increase not just in our output, but an increase in our capacity. So how do we do that? How can we bring about an increase in our capacity? Well, we can do it by adding any of these things. So human resources. We can do that by adding human capital, by better educating our workers, or in general, by adding workers. So if you look down here and you look at this little formula for real GDP, it's number of hours of work done by people times the output per hour is what's going to give us real GDP. So yes, we can get there by simply adding more people. But remember, productivity is a better way to get there because that will have a bigger impact on standard of living. So human resources, this entire graphic here is talking about human resources and things we can do to help with human resources. We can also get growth with more natural resources. So if we find suddenly more minerals, if we find more petroleum, if we find better sources of silicon, whatever, additional natural resources can also cause economic growth. Developing more capital goods. So we can have technological progress where we actually have a new capital good like artificial intelligence, or we can simply buy more of the existing capital goods. So if we add more computers to an economy, or if we add more cranes or more trucks, we'll have growth. But we can stimulate a lot of additional growth if we actually have innovation. And of course, public policy can help with this because policy can encourage investment. Policy can encourage savings that creates the money or the loanable funds that are available for investment. Public policy can create new infrastructure. For example, in places where the government freely provides access to Wi-Fi. That's going to increase business productivity and efficiency a great deal. One thing to remember on the AP test is when you're talking about economic growth and you're making the connection between, for example, low interest rates and increased investment, and you're making that connection to growth, make sure that you note that the investment is in capital goods and that you are, when you are investing or when a firm is investing, that is adding to the capital stock. Because the AP readers really want to make sure that you understand that investing doesn't mean buying stocks and bonds. That investing means buying new capital and adding to the nation's capital stock or the nation's total inventory of capital. When the nation adds to its inventory of capital, that is what creates the opportunity for economic growth. Here's just a little bit more to help you see the causes of economic growth in the US. So when we talk about education, you often hear negative things about our education system now, but it's important to think about our population. If you go back to 1950, only a very small percentage of our population were college graduates. Not even 40% were high school graduates in 1950. So the focus on education around the early 1980s, early to mid 1980s, we became very critical of our education system. But over time, we continued to produce more and more high school graduates and also more and more college graduates. So we have a lot higher education level, a lot higher productivity and human capital than we had in our economy before. This, if you want to pause and read this table, it also gives you just some interesting examples of how technology has provided cost reductions in our economy. And if you just look at the first one, I'll just read the first one for you. The cost of storing 1 megabit of information, enough for a 320-page book, in 1975 was $5,257. By 1999, 17 cents. It's probably 1 cent now. So new technology, innovations, new improvements in productivity make it so much more efficient in our economy now. So I would recommend pausing and reading the rest of those. They're all really good examples. And in class, we will review the PPC, the LRAS, and look at some of the impacts of different policy choices or different things that might happen in an economy that will improve economic growth.